Hey everybody, happy Father's Day first of all, and once again it's time for the weekly Q&A, so let's go ahead and get this started. I only saw so many really good questions this week. I really hope next week I get a lot more solid questions, so I'm going to do a couple of off topics at the end, and I'm just going to cover 8 basic fitness related questions. But I did manage to find 8 that were actually pretty good, so let's go ahead and roll with this. First question. All right, this question, it was fantastic because the person came back and they re-asked a much longer question instead of their original one so that I could understand what they were talking about. But let's go ahead and go with it. Why is it that a doctor, surgeon, clinical dietitian seem to make things more complicated than they need to be? Your typical response is the outdated black and white view. You need to stop eating sugar, saturated fat, processed foods. Oh, and have you seen those few studies that link meat consumption to cancer? While the more educated crowd from the fitness industry would have a more logical and practical response. You don't have to completely eliminate sugar, processed food, saturated fat. It's more so the overconsumption of food that is the cause, and the lack of plant-based foods that leads to the majority of health issues. All right, think about what you said. You actually just said that the more educated people in the fitness industry, and I know some of them actually are pretty smart guys, and some of them absolutely have their own agendas, and even though they're educated, I wouldn't describe them as particularly intelligent. They skirted by through grad school at best. The one I do really like, though, is Alan Aragon. Now, all of that being said, you're saying that the people in the fitness industry are more educated than clinical dietitians, surgeons, people like that. Stop and think about that for a minute. That's really funny when you think about it, when you've got to remember that a lot of people in the fitness agenda work, there we go, there was a Freudian slip. The fitness industry have their own private agendas, they have their own product-based agendas selling diet books, and a lot of them are used to working very specifically with physique competitors, people who have very, very high activity levels who can burn through a lot more calories than other people. For most people, it is the processed foods that leads to the overconsumption, because most people who don't work out every day, they're not doing cardio every single day, they're not deadlifting 500 pounds for reps, they're not squatting 400 pounds for reps. Like a lot of these people's clients are simply not going to burn through as many calories, and so they're going to way overconsume if they're eating very much processed food at all. Even sometimes their attempts at moderation are going to put them into a weight gain spiral. And so what you're not understanding is that they're dealing with a different demographic of people, and it's really silly when you look at it from that perspective, because for the general population who maybe only exercises at all 3 times a week, even if they're active, if they're taking their doctor's advice, they can't sit around eating ice cream and Pop-Tarts and stuff every day unless they're chronic undereaters, the people with no appetite. But if they have normal appetites or even high appetites, these people are going to gain body fat. They're going to get fat. Number 2, what you have to remember is that even in the long term, even a lot of processed foods, a lot of these things, the refined sugars, refined oils, things like that, in the long term, it might not seem to affect body composition in these highly active people. But after 20 or 25 years of doing this, these things could begin to have a chronic effect anyways. So there are concerns about insulin sensitivity, cancer, things like that. Now, can a lot of that be offset with the physical activity? Absolutely, but can it be completely offset? Can the risk be completely mitigated of consuming these sort of foods every day? Maybe not, and there's a good possibility that probably not. But the thing that you have to remember is, at the end of the day, most of the people in the fitness industry have agendas geared towards body composition, towards competition, towards selling supplements. There's a very strong predisposition towards that. And so they're going to have different information than people who are used to dealing with the general population and just concerned with overall health and, well, fitness, because health and fitness are kind of synonymous to some extent. So these people are going to have a different message due to that. But always remember that a lot of people in the fitness industry, the vast majority, in fact, have their own financial and, in some cases, even social agendas that can tie back to finances in some way. So never forget that. All right, next question. What causes herniated disc with lifting and how to prevent it? I know you'll probably say things like bad form, etc., but is there anything else? I've seen so many YouTubers / powerlifters getting herniated discs lately that it makes me even afraid to squat, deadlift. Don't tell me all of them have bad form. Well, I think you're wrong. I think most of them have bad form who you're talking about to some extent, and the rest use inappropriate loading parameters. That's the thing that you're seeing with a lot of these YouTubers who are doing this. A lot of them do seem to have bad form, who've hurt themselves. I mean, I could name a couple immediately. Lane Norton and Nick Wright, who've both had back issues in the past, and they both have atrocious form that anyone looking at the mechanics of some of their lifts will absolutely cringe. Others, a lot of the others out there, if you look at them, their loading parameters are incorrect. They push too much workload, too much volume all the time, and doing it with too much frequency. And when you combine those things together, that will eventually start to herniate disc, because think about it, your bones get stress cracks in them from lifting also. People forget that. They're always talking about tearing muscle down as if that's really a real deal. That's a whole nother topic. I need to discuss that later too, that silly myth. But you do cause stress cracks all through bone, and over time your body fills those stress cracks back in. It calcifies them, it makes them stronger, it puts more minerals into those cracks so that you get denser bones, better bone mineralization. But if you keep loading with so much workload and volume that they don't have time to fully heal, they don't have time to fully recover from these really serious workloads, sometimes eventually those stress cracks don't recover in time. If they don't recover in time, they get bigger. And if they get too big, you're going to see disc herniation. So it's this excessive workload that a lot of people utilize can over time cause these things. And it's something I realized in my own training when I was doing powerlifting back in the UK competitively, that some of my workloads were really getting excessive. And the thing is, I actually feel better now. I even have a better body composition now that I'm doing like 10 to 20% of the weekly workloads I was doing at one time during my accumulation phases. I was doing, you guys remember, something like 30 sets of squats, 30 sets of rows, 30 sets of bench press a week was not uncommon with weights. It's 80% plus of my max. So factor that in. And yeah, I was putting myself at risk for these sort of things while trying to be more competitive. So it just goes with the territory. You've got to be aware that trying to push those workloads to be competitive can absolutely damage you over time. You throw bad form into the mix and it's a recipe for disaster. All right, next question. Hi Jason, I'm having some trouble with my deadlift form. I've noticed that I have pretty bad upper back rounding while deadlifting. My lower back looks good with slight lumbar extension throughout the movement, and my upper back starts out nice and straight at the bottom of the lift, but as soon as I begin to pull the weight off the floor, my upper back starts to round forward badly. You don't sound like you had bad form at all. You notice that I use thoracic rounding all the time on my deadlift. That's how I deadlift. That's how many champions deadlift who are completely injury free. Some of the strongest deadlifters in the world who, again, have never had a back issue actually deadlift that way. Thoracic rounding is perfectly acceptable as long as your thoracic spine is fairly strong. It's your lumbar, your lower back that you're worried about rounding, and you are avoiding that, it sounds like, with just rounding of the thoracic region. That's perfectly acceptable as long as you're not getting any pain, discomfort in that area. Then you should be fine. Again, going back to the last question about excessive workloads, as long as you're not using excessive workload. But you need to remember, thoracic rounding, as long as all the musculature is strong, isn't actually dangerous inherently on the deadlift. It's just a different technique, and many of us find it to be more effective, give better leverage as everything else. All right, next question. Hey Jason, what age would you introduce young people to weight training in order for them to reap the benefits but not harm their physical development? Thanks. Weight training with proper form and workloads shouldn't injure their physical development. You could start at whatever age they have the coordination and the focus and the interest in doing so. Don't make a child weight lift who doesn't want to do it, who doesn't seem to think it's going to be a fun activity, because children will tend to flop and just go through the motions and use bad technique just to get it over with if they don't actually enjoy doing it. And it's the bad technique that can lead to injury. So for one child, it might be 5 years old, and another, it might be 15 years old. That has to be assessed on a case by case basis. There's not going to be a universal rule to something like that. And the only other thing I would point out is that if they're not done with puberty yet, I wouldn't go over about a 50% of their 1 rep max on anything. So you could do that based upon looking and seeing what they can do 10 to 12 reps with, and maybe reduce the weight slightly from there on any given exercise. You don't need to focus on very much progressive overload in children. They're just trying to get better bone density, a little bit of muscle tone, and better form. They're not going to gain tremendous strength usually. and they're not going to gain large amounts of muscle hypertrophy. So you don't need to actually push them hard. You just need to make it fun physical activity that works on their coordination, power, things like that, if you have them do it at all. But the main thing is that their mental attitude towards it and their ability to actually focus and get it done because they find it enjoyable. All right, next question. You said in one of your videos that to gain muscle you didn't need weight gainer shakes. You mentioned milk, peanut butter, and wouldn't ask but can't find the video. The other thing that I mentioned was bananas. And yeah, you don't need weight gain shakes. Weight gain shakes are just a product usually filled with massive chunks of sugar and a bunch of cheap whey protein and stuff in them to rip you off. Basically, they're charging you 5 times what that shake would be worth if you just made this big mess of stuff anyways. Again, just because something is sold in the supplement industry doesn't mean it's useful. In fact, the majority of the time, there are better alternatives to anything the supplement industry is selling in terms of flavor, effectiveness, cost, everything else. Weight gain shakes are just another hustle. You should have no reason to do those. Just eat food. There's nothing magical about them other than they dump large amounts of refined sugar in there. Well, if someone wanted to eat large amounts of refined sugar, they could just go get a spoon and a bag of sugar. I wouldn't recommend it, or they could just drink soda, or they could drink a bunch of fruit juice. It's no need to buy these expensive shakes. It's just ridiculous. Just eat real foods to gain muscle. And in fact, unless you have a very serious under-eating problem, like about 10% of the population, then you probably can easily consume enough foods with whole foods, again, barring maybe you have an extremely physically active job in addition to your training in the gym, in which case you could back your training workloads down. But outside of these sort of situations, most people are probably going to gain too much body fat if they're trying to force extra food in to gain weight. You have to remember, you're only going to gain so much muscle, and yeah, you're probably going to gain some fat when you bulk, no matter what you do once you're out of that early novice phase. But you shouldn't need to force feed yourself things like weight gain shakes. If you're doing that, you probably, again, barring those couple situations I listed, you probably are just going to gain excessive amounts of body fat, and the majority of the weight you're gaining is fat at that point. You can't gain muscle as fast as the industry's tried to convince young men that they can do. All right, next question. Why is it that in order for me to attain abs and yet fairly low body fat percentage, 12%, I have to cut to around 170 pounds at 5 foot 7 inches? Yet I see others such as Chris Jones and many of my friends of a similar height get lean and have abs at around 185 to 190 pounds. Is it just genetic? Honestly, if you're talking 12% body fat at 5 foot 7, the guys doing that and getting nice abs at 12% at 185 pounds are the genetic elite. They're the genetic outliers. You're talking 1 to 2% of guys are going to be able to do that. So in a few cases, yeah, it's just genetics. But in the majority of the cases, these guys, even some of the guys you might be seeing on YouTube or whatever, barring those tiny few people with really, really good genetics, it's an issue of they're just using drugs and not telling you about it, guys. They're just fake natties. So you got a lot of friends. If you're describing multiple friends having this, statistically, there's no way you have multiple friends who are genetic outliers like that. Maybe one. So if you know several people doing that, then it's definitely going to be drugs. Now, hitting 190 at 12% with good abs, that's probably not genetics either. That extra 5 pounds makes a big difference on the fat-free mass index. This is someone who's now gained over 30 pounds of muscle in their entire training life. So unless they started out a lot shorter and they weren't developed yet when they started lifting, if they were mature adults, 21 and up, and they've put on 35 pounds of muscle in their training career, you can call that flat out as drugs. That's not genetics at that point. And I've got whole videos explaining the math on that for people who don't grasp it. I have people argue with me until they go look at the math and look at my breakdowns of it. But that is going to be drugs. That's not genetics or training at that point. They are using drugs and just lying to you about it or not telling you. All right, next question. Hey Jason, does doing compound movements for a pause position recruit more motor units than using a stretch reflex? If so, shouldn't everyone do everything from a pause position if they want to gain the most strength as possible? Honestly, it really depends on the exercises and the range of motion used. If you can utilize the same range of motion, in theory, a stretch reflex can recruit more motor units, more muscle fibers throughout the entirety of a lift, whereas than anything at the pause position has to recruit the most right at the start. But the thing is, oftentimes, the amount that you recruit right at the start is going to be so high that it's going to give you more total motor units recruited per rep. So what I would say to you is that every exercise that you do needs to either be an exercise that you can do from a dead stop at the bottom and pause, or it needs to be an exercise that you can actually cause a myotatic or a stretch reflex in it. And that's going to require some research for you guys to determine the difference there. But generally speaking, any exercise that doesn't do one of those the way that you perform it, you can either do a pause lift or that you can recruit a stretch reflex, is probably not going to recruit as many muscle fibers as the movements that can do those. So it's something that you should probably factor in. But yeah, a pause training, pausing from a dead stop at the bottom of an exercise, is absolutely going to recruit tremendous amounts of muscle fibers on big compound movements. But again, so can a stretch reflex. You've also got to look at which one's going to give you a longer range of motion. If you're doing a partial exercise that gives you a stretch reflex, it might be because it only is superior for one body part. And I'll give you a perfect example. The conventional deadlift from a dead stop to where you pause on every rep is going to recruit way more muscle fibers through your whole body than, say, a Romanian deadlift with a stretch reflex, which has a shorter range of motion. However, that stretch reflex in the Romanian deadlift is specifically in the hamstrings. So all other factors being equal, the Romanian deadlift is going to probably recruit more muscle fibers for you in your hamstrings than the conventional deadlift will. Is it going to be a tremendous amount more? Probably not. But will it be more? Yeah. So you're looking at the issue sometimes too of is it recruiting more total muscle fibers through more muscle groups, or is it something that focuses on one specific muscle group as a priority? So again, it can be a complicated topic, and it's hard to pin that down other than a case-by-case basis to say which one you should be doing for your goals. All right, next question. What's your opinion on weight loss surgery? Do you have any strong stance for or against? Do you consider it cheating like a lot of fitness people do? You know, here's the thing, guys. Everyone comes in with this silly cheating nonsense. Cheating is only cheating when you're in some sort of competitive environment with rules in place. Outside of that, you should be doing whatever you have to reach whatever goals and total goals that you want to achieve. And sometimes those goals might be silly. For example, you might say, well, my goals are to be IFBB pro size. Well, it's going to kill you to do that. So it's probably a really stupid goal. But if it's a serious goal to you, then you're going to do whatever it requires to get there. Outside of a competitive environment, if your goal is to lose weight, and you qualify for one of these surgeries, that's not cheating. That's called getting yourself healthy if you're 150 pounds overweight. In lots of environments in the world, doing whatever it takes to reach a goal or to win is not cheating. That's like saying using superior technology in war is cheating. No, that's called winning. Last time I checked, war didn't have tons of specific little rules as a contest on a point system. And it's funny when a lot of people in the fitness industry talk about this, because many of them, their only competitive endeavor is a subjective art form. So don't even get me started on a lot of them who are doing physique competitions talking about cheating instead of something with a points-based system. Because at the end of the day, even those guys who are cheating, it's because the judges all know their own drugs, and they can look at them and tell anyone with a trained eye can with a lot of these guys, and they're just choosing to pass them anyways. But that's a whole other issue. You've got to look at it this way. If they followed the right protocols and the doctors have determined that the weight loss surgery is the only effective way for them because they've tried other methods, they can't get their appetite under control, they can't get everything under control to lose that 100 plus pounds they need to lose, a surgery is potentially life-saving for them. So, you know, at the end of the day, if push comes to shove, I would rather be considered a cheater by a bunch of morons on the internet than be dead, to die of heart disease or to die of cancers or die of diabetes related issues because I wouldn't be able to lose that last 150 pounds due to whatever's going on in my body. I would much rather be alive and be called a cheater by a bunch of fucking morons on the internet who bodybuild than to be dead and have them say, man, but he did it all on his own and he gave it 100%. So when you really think about it from that perspective, think about how moronic that really is. I mean, these are people who have, again, extremely moronic ideas. So they would rather someone not be a cheater than they would for them to still be alive. So when you look at it in that perspective, these people, their moral arguments are just absurd. All right, next question. And this is an off-topic question, but it's really pertinent given everything that's happened recently. Should we ban people on the terror watch and no-fly list from buying guns? I'm going to kind of keep my personal opinions out of this because anyone who watches my firearm channel already knows my personal opinions. And let's look at what actual experts who make these sort of lists and who review these lists actually say. When this came out earlier this week or last week, the director of the FBI actually said that he personally opposes people on the terrorist watch list from being banned from this. And the reason for it is very simple. If they are on a terrorist watch list, they're watching them to see if they can connect them to other terrorists. They don't have enough evidence to convict them of anything. That's a very, very important point there. They don't have any evidence enough yet to arrest them or convict them. And they can also lead them to other terrorists if they continue to do what they're doing, as they can keep an eye on them by flagging them to not buy a gun. Because if you go to buy a firearm in the United States and you get denied, and you don't have a criminal record, you're looking at the list of stuff and you know that you're okay, and you are denied buying a firearm, you know for a fact something else is going on. There's a big deal going on. If you have spoken to a terrorist somewhere, you know that you're now being watched for a fact, and because you wouldn't have continued to talk to them if you thought you were being watched. So what that does, that alerts them to the fact that they're now being watched. They're going to behave themselves. They're probably going to break all contact with these people, and the FBI is now going to have a far more difficult time catching the actual terrorists. So this is a stupid idea. And you guys already know that I don't have a problem with bad people having guns in the right environment, because for things that I've discussed on my other channel about dealing with active shooters and things, they can easily be dispatched if you just have enough armed civilians nearby. These mass shooters and crazy things only happen in gun-free zones for a reason, because when they happen in places like Texas, where there are armed people everywhere and not in a gun-free type zone, these people don't kill anyone hardly. They kill like one person and then they die. So these people don't hit those areas. So getting rid of gun-free zones is your solution. Now, the other thing to factor in too is that you've got to realize from a court perspective, these people, you're going to take someone who's on a terrorist watch list and you're going to make them a millionaire. You start doing this stuff and you try to pass laws to do that, they have a constitutional right until they have been convicted of a felony, and there are other rules around that. Even previous felons can get those rights restored in the right circumstances, believe it or not. There's a lot of people who they can get their full constitutional rights restored. So it's not even that simple. Or that they've been mentally adjudicated by a judge. You can't take people's right to keep and bear arms away. If you do, you violated their constitutional rights. So if you write a law like that that's unconstitutional and they sue the government over it, when it's struck down as unconstitutional, you're going to take a potential terrorist and give him $1 million of your tax money. So that's also problematic. It's a really, really bad idea for a couple of reasons there. You're actually going to fund terrorism potentially in the long term with this sort of nonsense, and it's not going to prevent crimes in any way. It could actually make them worse. So do I think that it should be done? No. I agree with the FBI director, who is largely responsible for what's done with these lists and whose job it is to make sure that they're utilized correctly. I'm going to agree with the director of the FBI and say, no, absolutely not. This is a really stupid idea. All right, next question and last question of the week. What is your opinion on Alex Jones, InfoWars, and Tim Kennedy, exploders of corruption or just sensationalist conspiracy theorists? If you really look at it, I think it's a combination of both. The thing is, what you find is that a lot of this stuff falls into the area of what you call conspiracy fiction, which means there is some truth to it. There is definitely some corruption. There's definitely conspiracies. Anyone who thinks that wealthy and powerful people and politicians around the world aren't corrupt enough to actually do clandestine activities that serve their own interests and agenda is a complete moron. That is an absurd line of thought. Even poor people do that sort of thing. It's just that wealthy people do it also. Does that mean that there is some massive Illuminati global conspiracy to do whatever? No. But there are real conspiracies. There is real corruption all over the world. And some of it is more extreme than some people would actually believe. I'm not going to go into any details on that, but yeah, there is a lot of it that's real. However, when you take something like Alex Jones, since 2/3 of what he throws out is sensationalism, it can all be considered sensationalism and fiction. And that would give someone like Alex Jones leverage to actually reveal like 1/3 of stuff that really is legitimate conspiracies and corruption going on and mask it under the guise of conspiracy fiction. Because again, 2/3 of the stuff is either very, very exaggerated or just outright fabrication, in which case, you can just, he's not going to be considered a credible source, therefore he's not going to find himself in much trouble, he can be ignored, he's not going to get bumped off, he's not going to piss the wrong people off because it can all be laughed off to some extent. So it allows for a certain amount of truth to come out that's been researched and that can be made public without it really being a problem. So there's ways to do that. There's ways to do that even for people to not violate NDAs and everything else. So they just got to be careful with it. Now, the other thing is it a business? Is it sensationalism? Yes, of course it is. Alex Jones makes a fortune doing what he does. There's good money in conspiracy fiction. Hell, I've considered getting into it myself on the internet in terms of like YouTube and things, but I've chosen not to because I know how much money is in it and I know how to spend all of it. I'm very familiar with all of it and I know just enough of the real truth to make it all work because that's what makes it believable. So there can absolutely be big money in this, and that's the thing that you need to realize when you look at some of these bigger conspiracy guys out there. People on both sides of the fence need to realize people who think it's all nonsense versus people who are believing all of it. The actual truth is going to be somewhere in the middle. It is a business for these people. They are making really good money doing it. In fact, I've known of some individuals making almost 7 figures per year in the conspiratainment area. So it absolutely is a business, but people do need to realize that there is always going to be an element of truth in there, and there's going to be a large element of sensationalism, because if there's not enough truth and documentation to back some of it, they're not going to get a big audience. So people who are going to look at it and say, oh, it's all nonsense, no, that's not going to be true. If you look closer, there's going to be some real truth in any of those. But for the people who are buying all of it, you're a naive sheep also, because essentially you have to realize that if it was all truth, these people would be in so much shit that they would be dead long before they have the audiences that they have. They would find themselves in real trouble. They would be bumped off real quick. Don't let them convince you otherwise. So the truth of the matter is somewhere in between the two extremes, like it is with most things in life. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.